camera rolling.
Okay. Then, thank you for this dialogue today. And just to start with, to present your work, maybe, which is your research line of each one of you. And then we will start with the first question.
So I do research on media literacy, largely in a European context, and mostly with children and young people. And I'm interested in the ways that media literacy has been debated according to lots of different dimensions by academics, and the very many claims which are being made about media literacy. So I'm also interested in it as a policy, and how it could be stimulated, could be promoted, could be enabled in different kinds of settings and for different kinds of constituencies.
I'm Peter Lewis. I'm a lecturer, senior lecturer in community media, which is an unusual title, I think, in this country, at London Metropolitan University. And currently I'm involved in a research project funded by the HERA agency. It's called Transnational Radio Encounters, a team of 6 different projects within that main programme, 4 of which deal with mainstream media, and I and a colleague in the University of Sunderland are looking particularly at community media, which is something I've been specialising in over a long period of time. But I should say community radio. Community media, of course, embraces social media and video and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then from your point of view and your work, your specialization now in your area, what kind of needs do you think that you can improve or help to be done from media literacy projects or from community media projects?
So do you want us to talk to each other?
Okay.
Yes, and not look at the camera so much. Yes, okay.
Would that
Yeah.
be better?
Yes.
See, I
Because
think it
addressed
will be
the camera
better.
for that
Yes,
reason.
sorry.
Okay.
And
That's
me,
okay.
it's the
Yeah,
first
okay.
one, and yes, I
Okay,
think.
so we'll try to...
What kind of needs,
Well,
social
shall I
needs?
say, I mean,
Okay.
I think the existence of community media, community radio, is because of an absence in the mainstream media of programs for marginalised groups. In fact, many of these groups would say that mainstream media distort, ignore particularly their needs, and these would be a voice, for instance. Community media has been described as a voice for the voiceless, and even, I mean, women are a social minority, you might say, because scandalously there's not enough representation of women in the staffing of mainstream media, and women have formed a very long-standing part of community radio in Europe, anyway.
I suppose I think of media literacy as embracing that, but also wider. So it would also include, for example, the critical skills to interrogate mass media texts and to understand why it is that certain groups are not represented or not included in television or in film or in the mainstream press. So there's the critical reading of other media, and there's also the creating of media. And I suppose, I mean, it's interesting to think about radio, because I think in many developing countries' context, radio is really crucial, but very often when I work with children and young people, radio is not what they're interested in.
Yes.
They're interested in creating blogs and social networks and, you know, other kinds of, I don't know, videos to go on YouTube.
In our society here, and in most Western European countries, that's increasingly the case. I think radio is awkward. People don't know what a radio is. It makes you have to listen and stop multitasking, and it tells you what it's going to do. It's interesting that most people I know who teach radio in the UK find they have to force feed their students with speech radio first in order to get them to understand, you know, that what the genre can offer.
Because everyone is listening, right? I mean, radio is still fantastically occupying many hours of the day, and I don't know if it comes from a radio or it comes from your phone or from your computer, but so radio is around in our environment, but I suspect it's generally music rather than spoken.
And often just downloaded from iTunes or YouTube illegally.
In which case the radio part is not really the point. So the question is, where does the speech come from? Where do people get the voice from? And what are the different media places where they can find that access?
I mean, to go back to your original point, historically, let's take, say, the end of the 60s, early 70s, when there was a large-scale rebellion by sections of the community, young people, campaigns against the Vietnam War, traditional industries being closed down, and trade unions were fighting to keep jobs. And what happened? Well, the Glasgow University Media Group was one of the first to show that what you were saying, that there was no kind of coverage, and they started to analyse it. So going further along the line, or indeed even at that time, except in this country, a community radio across the world was doing that job. And so people start by seeing what is absent, or analysing the distortions and why they occur. Then you train them, which is part of what you're saying. You train them to use the media,
and I guess, I mean, you might include in media literacy. Okay, so traditionally one might define that really simply as being able to access, use and create media in any format. A skilled communicator is going to make the best decision about which of the different kinds of medium to use. You know, when is it better to create some radio? When is it better to tweet? You know, your protest. Maybe now young people would tweet rather than creating a program. When does video speak more than 1,000 words? All of that. So I think many people now would say there's a panoply of possible ways of communicating, and it's part of the skill, not only about how you create it, but also how you best reach your audience.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
And I wonder where, I'm curious about where radio fits in.
I think, I mean, when a lot of us teach radio, the first thing is we ask people to take the plugs out of their ears and start listening to the sounds around as part of that. But also, I'm drying up, so you can cut this bit out.
Let's say
I
something
want to say,
about
I want to talk about co-presence. I mean, I'll come back to your point about the choice, but I think the presence on the airwaves, therefore, and in the last 10, 15 years on internet as well, the creation of sound in public space, which is speech, but also music, is very important. So that, and to take an example in this country, in Bristol there's a station called Radio Salam Shalom, where the station manager has said that more important than the juxtaposition on the schedules of programs for the Muslim and the Jewish community is the discussion that goes on to create the schedules, where the two communities have to talk to each other. So, of course, that can be the case in both internet radio and broadcast radio. And again, I think I don't hardly know of a station now that doesn't use Facebook and Twitter to promote itself and to draw in an audience and so on.
So if I define media literacy now differently as what you need to know in order to communicate in your world to the audience you want, then those requirements are changing as all the different modes of media become more multimodal, and people are integrating social networking with radio, with, I don't know, other kinds of...
Sorry, it's in this discussion you are, because it's a question.
Sí, es un problema de
corbata. Just, it's just a technical problem, but it's very good. No, but it's very good discussion.
You're happy
started
with how we're doing it? Good.
Okay.
All right.
Because it's just to find this common space, and just it was this need to done. Okay. And then to follow just the discussion, you were finding this common space. No, now at this moment you were discussing about from the practices. Sí.
Do you want a bit of history, which I've got involved in? Interest you? You're not running at the moment, no? Well, I'll tell you what it is. I've been involved in. I'm telling Sonia this really. University of Bristol have got connected communities money, that kind of stuff, HRC. It's called Know Your Bristol. And so I've got involved with, I'm a consultant getting digitisation of archives from the 70s of video made by people on the Bristol Channel Network.
Bristol is a really interesting city. I know someone who, do you know Kerry Facer?
No.
Yes. In the education. So I think she's involved in that. So she was working with geographers to get young people to make a map of all the spaces where young people could have a voice within the city.
Yeah.
And it would be an online kind of visual geographic
Hotspots
network.
that actually can be triggered by your smartphone, and you can hear and see video
I think,
and so on.
but
Yeah?
yes, I'm not sure. But also, what are the kind of youth-friendly spaces? What are hangout zones?
Oh yes,
what
I
are
see what you mean. Yes,
so
yes, yeah.
that they would kind of see that youth had a spread and a space and a voice across the city.
Yes,
And
yes.
it sounded really nice. I haven't seen what
Mm.
it produced as a result, but
I think in this particular part of it's a very big project, and the recovery of video archives from the 70s is only a small part of it. The idea eventually it'll be online, and it will be accessible as people move around their area, and zones will either be visually shown, or your phone will vibrate and you will be able to look at other ages in that particular place. You know.
I think a lot of oral history work actually is being
Yes.
used in that way. So it's the latest technology, and it assumes a kind of mobile individual moving around the space, but what it activates then is the layers of history.
And maybe this technological convergence that you are talking about, no, the difference between traditional media and new media, no, that it's a convergence. Maybe it's could be an opportunity for this common space between the stand-ups of media literacy and community media, and maybe what we need is more common research or more common practices, because
I've come across it in a Grundtvig-funded project I was involved with called ComApp, Community Media Applications, where obviously training was required for young people and old people. Actually, it looked particularly at young school children and also older generations, and it's the older generations that actually need to acclimatise themselves to the newer media. But once that was done, an example from Freiburg in Germany was where young people and old people shared their knowledge of where they used to play and how they used to play, so that the two generations were talking to each other, and subsequently made a map which was again activated by smartphones and so on.
I think when we talk about the convergence, there's a kind of paradox that people in research but also in practice are struggling with, which is, on the one hand, the technology enables new kinds of voices and new kinds of understanding and new layers of meaning, but on the other hand it creates new barriers, and it can be older people, it can also be younger people in certain circumstances if they don't have the technology, but also if they're not familiar or not comfortable with the ways of integrating it and interpreting it. And it can be all kinds who are reluctant or feel disempowered, so new possibilities but also new kinds of exclusion that aren't easily noticed sometimes.
I mean, what we were talking about earlier, the reluctance of young people to actually use speech in the traditional form, it might be another barrier. I think that's exaggerated.
I think young people are actually there all
talk
the whole time. Yes.
We've both got children about the same age, I think.
Yes.
So
and they never stop talking.
It's true, even if they can't spell. But the students I teach sometimes have to be introduced to the notion of books. Because Google Books, for instance, will only give you the chapter within an edited compilation, and you don't even know what book you're reading, because you're just reading.
Now we'll sound like old fogies, but I was thinking the other day how we tell our students to go to this link and this link and this link, and that's all you need to read. And the days when you used to go to the library and there were thousands of books and you had to choose and judge. And now I think often we would say media literacy skills are really about judgment and making those decisions about what's relevant, what's interesting, what's important. Now Google makes those decisions for you. That's probably not a very literate strategy, even though it seems very, media savvy.
I mean, media literacy in first-year students at the university I teach at, which is incidentally about the bottom of the ranking. I don't accept that particular thing, but the LSE wouldn't have to do this with its students, I think. But I actually bring them to the library and make them wander around the corridors of bookshelves.
We do that.
You do. It isn't something that, you see, that's media literacy training, isn't it? It is. Well, you may not include it in all the work you've done, but
No,
you're doing it as a teacher.
Yes, no, I think it's often about making people aware, expanding their ideas of what are the possible communicative options open to them, and making them feel that the barriers to using particular bits of technology are reduced, but also making them see how the judgments that they might be familiar with in one medium can be thought about in another. So they might actually be very well trained from school in how to make judgments about what to read in a book, but they don't necessarily think critically about what they get on a Google search result, or they don't necessarily think critically about what they see on the mainstream news. So it's partly about making them take their, wherever they do make more nuanced judgments, and see that those should be made across all different media.
I would be interested to move on to talk about migrants, of which there are so many different kinds. I mean, in Britain we have immigrant communities who've been here for a long time, and over the generations, their language, their mother tongue, has become less known by the younger people, and also migrants from, say, Eastern Europe, who don't find in radio or other media their language reduced so often. In all cases, I think there's a tendency to listen to the satellite or watch satellite television to keep in touch and so on. But I think in this very xenophobic country that we live in, a lot of people who arrive here, refugees and so on, have been interrogated in a really hostile way before being let into the country, and have had to tell their stories. And I, for instance, remember a group of people in Peterborough who, because in the particular setting they felt comfortable and were gradually being allowed to give a voice, finally managed to tell for the first time stories about where they'd come from. And that's there's another question that's interesting me in the current research at the moment, which is that a first step would be to give those people a channel of communication, a slot in, say, a radio program, whether it's internet or broadcast, in which they can speak their language. And they'll be speaking to the rest of the people in the local community, and perhaps communicating with our homeland and the rest of the diaspora. But there's another step that needs to be taken, is how do they communicate with the host country? And there's not, in the research I've done so far, there's a station might have about 5 or 10 different channels for different languages, but each one is speaking only in that language, and there's very little
themselves.
Yes.
So it's the Tower of Babel.
Indeed. So I think there's work done in Austria particularly, which has looked at what they call multilingual programming, where you have bilingual presenters, or a bilingual presenter, and the host language and the new one are interwoven with a lot of music, which keeps people interested, because you have, of course, 3 listening communities. You have the bilinguals and the monolinguals, and all must be kept happy. So
you're talking about a world. I mean, I agree with this, the importance of this, and how where we could see improved ways of communication across linguistic and cultural boundaries. But you're assuming a happy world of trust, and I could explain that in several ways. So one of the strands of media literacy is to think critically about how information is used and where it might be misused. So a group might want to communicate something about its experience of immigration and the visa authorities and so on in its own language, but not necessarily wish the host language to misunderstand that, or indeed the authorities to listen in and abuse that. So I think we also need to think about ways in which people talk to themselves necessarily, because this is not a harmonious, there are so many conflicts. And that makes me think about the distrust that people have of all kinds of converging media technologies now, and rightly so, because actually everything is being listened to, and we do need to be very careful. I know there's lots of worry now, for example, about using Facebook as a protest site, and how it is then that your legitimate bottom-up expression of political protest or concern might get abused by those listening in now, or indeed any time in the future, and identities are retained, and information is heard differently in different contexts. So media literacy has to be about legitimate distrust and understanding carefully how communication can be misused, as well as overcoming boundaries and producing better mutual understanding.
I think we've got the beginnings of a project that we should mutually apply for European funding, because I don't think in the world that I live in there's been enough attention to that need to choose and to, as you say, legitimately mistrust. Although that starts, I mean, I go back to what I said at the beginning, the springboard for most alternative media is a distrust of the mainstream. But then, so you separate, you have a voice, and then you consider whether you come back to address the community that drove you out in the first place or didn't accept you in a friendly way. That's an important decision to make, I think. Who's going to use this material, by the way? How much will be used?
Yes, exactly. How is this? Who will edit us and,
or
decide what we've really said? Yes.
Yeah.
And in this way you are talking now, for example, what kind of can you imagine that, for example, in one project you can develop in the framework of media literacy, that you can introduce some knowledge coming from community media, for example, or some practices more specific on community media that maybe can help to improve your project on media literacy with kids and young people, for example? Could you be possible? And in the other side, the same.
Well, I can think of several possible ways in which the different fields could intersect. And one is media literacy research sometimes talks quite monolithically about people, you know, who needs to know about the media and who needs to understand. So the importance of thinking about differentiation is crucial. So, for example, in Britain, a lot of the media literacy research is produced by the regulator, Ofcom, and they segment by age and occasionally by socioeconomic status, but they don't really ask, you know, are you a native speaker or are you a migrant or what are the cultures, what culture are you part of? And what they really don't ask and could understand better is about the purposes of communication. So we need our communication skills to achieve certain purposes, and those purposes might come from our migrant status, they might come from our local or rural status, they might, you know, there are all kinds of reasons to communicate, and understanding the relation between the skills we have and the skills we need and the purposes that we put those to, I think is really crucial. I mean, it's interesting that a lot of people in social movements have skilled up in social media because they are trying precisely to find a way of communicating outside the mainstream, and the skills have developed. But a contrast case might be a lot of schools and libraries that develop a youth media literacy production project, and they try to get the young people, actually also adults, to create something. But because there's no audience for that something they're making and no special purpose, you know, they pass a nice afternoon doing a bit of film editing, but it doesn't necessarily result in knowledge that they retain, and it doesn't necessarily result in some kind of communicative benefit. So so the purposes, I would say, for the thinking about migrants or communities, it's the driving need to communicate in particular ways that should lead the media literacy agenda, and not, you know, skills for skills' sake.
No, I don't think I was suggesting that. And I think I just pick you up on one point, little audience. It's true that in this sector of community radio, let's take the radio example, there is no there's no method of measuring audience such as is used in the mainstream, because the audiences are, in the first place, very small, but also quite fragmented within a particular station, so that, as I was saying, if there's a language program or several language programs, you've only got a small amount of people. The hope, of course, for such a station would be that people tune into it. Take an example like Resonance FM in this town, mostly music, but with some attention to migrants and established immigrant communities, an African program there and so on.
I don't even know about it. I'll go and listen to it. No.
Oh, it's wonderful. 104.4 if you're still using a dial.
I'm not.
No. So just
I have a digital radio, but I will find it.
Yes. No, it's really, it's owned by the London Musicians Collective and funded by the Arts Council, so some of our money is going to it. But I'm sorry, this bit you're going to have to cut because I can't get back to the point. Audience. This links to something that we were asked to consider. I think I'm always urging the underfunded community radio sector to look for its nearest college or university, because that would be a way to do in-depth qualitative research, which would be of benefit to students and to the lecturers and to the station itself. I mean, the audiences are significant, but in a qualitative kind of way. I'll say something else too, as a researcher in this field. An example would be Monday night I went to the House of Commons, where the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom were launching their Media Reform Manifesto. It's a very important cause, and most, I would say, people who teach media and research it in this country are looking at, of course, had traditionally looked at the press and television and internet and social media, and that's very important. And I'm a lone voice, really, finding out, and what about community media, even in this time of the importance of social media. And I still think that, as I said earlier, the co-presence within the construction of a station is important. People physically meet who haven't met before, and there is yes, go on. Yes,
maybe we are retaining a kind of 20th century conception of mainstream and community media, and maybe one of the things that the diversification of media platforms and channels is doing is moving us from, you know, one to many or one to one, and some to some becomes a possibility that we can communicate more within small groups, and our traditional or large groups, but it might morph, you know, the communication might flow in unpredictable ways. It might not be that you could say the majority of the population watched or heard X last night. So we're working with traditional metrics of reach and scale, and, you know, which are all about just sheer numbers. So if we really want to think about the value of community media, or the way of the importance of having your own voice and a space to express it, if we want to develop that, we need to think about other kinds of metrics, which could be qualitative and could be quantitative, but I think they should be linked to purpose. In other words, not did thousands of people hear what you said, but did the people you were trying to reach hear and understand what you said.
And what happened as a result of it.
Yes.
I mean, I began in educational broadcasting, and of course that that was always focused on what happened in the classroom, in schools television, for instance. And we're getting a lot of examples, of course, of things happening which media has facilitated, but of course it needs some anger and it needs some political movement, really, to then use media to affect it. I mean, I'm sure you don't subscribe to the view that the Arab Spring was as a result of social media. Yes. Yeah.
No, but maybe an interesting question is whether the Arab Spring would have happened without social media, or how it would have been different without. And I think, you know, that's where I would argue about mediation rather than media influence in any simple terms. The media have become part of the landscape of communication.
Can you maybe imagine from community media and also from the project on media literacy that if there are more voices coming together from the grassroots and being more in the streaming, finding the way from social media and others to be on the streaming, interacting between them, could be a big change, or this a challenge. For example, if we are improving for one side, community media, small community media, not only community media but also community programs.
So I'm something of a pessimist on this particular question, because it would seem that the barriers to creating your own content and having a voice and even disseminating it have been reduced, and yet, and here I would turn back to surveys, survey after survey after survey says it's a very small minority of people who takes up that opportunity for whatever reason and makes anything. I mean, it's a tiny percentage of the population, even in this very privileged country, who posts messages or uploads to YouTube rather than downloads, or records some kind of visual or audio content at all. And those who do it tend to be more privileged, more educated, more middle class. So even though the barriers seem to have reduced and the possibilities seem enhanced, I'm not yet sure that we're seeing that kind of transformation of diverse voices that we'd hoped for. And I don't know if that's a media literacy problem, or a social inequalities problem, or a policy problem.
I know the work, some of the work that you've done and the surveys undertaken. Did they look at areas where there was a local voice outlet? I mean, like in community media and so on.
It's
and I'll throw in one more thing.
I'm going to say it's still small.
Yeah.
It's still, I mean, I'm not. I don't think it has no effect,
yeah.
but it doesn't. It doesn't seem to be making the kind of step change that one might have hoped for.
I go back to that Jodie Dean argument that everything is lost in the blogosphere. That there are millions of voices that can't be picked up, and that people can just talk within their group, share material, where if you, under the, let's say, old-fashioned system of having a broadcast outlet, whether it's internet or over the airwaves, you are at least bringing together, as I say, both physically the people, but also within one stream of material, there's a possibility of dialogue. And I think actually, to look at it in another way, the diversity that we all wish for in British media is not so well provided for in the mainstream. And yes, of course, lots of people are tweeting and Facebooking with each other, but to look at where communities are talking to each other and the different parts of a geographical community, let's say, are aware of each other's existence and hearing what their needs are, well, that's taking place in 200 locations in this country and more. Yeah.
So I'll give you so this is my researcher's conundrum, really. So I can go to your 200 sites, or in my case, I can go to many of those very exciting spaces, maker spaces or digital media spaces, where often young people are creating something, getting excited, they're taking the steps to the skills, they make something, they reach an audience. It's fantastic. And then I think, why is there only 15 people in this room? What about the others? And when I go and interview the others, there are many other people who live around, they don't say, I didn't know about it, I'd love to come, I'll come next week. They say, oh, there's not really any point, it's too much bother, it sounds like a lot of people showing off, why, who would ever listen to anything I make, I haven't got any skills. So there's a lot of ways in which people exclude themselves, and they are sort of about trust and purpose and believing that communication is part of the solution to, they don't see that the problems they might have in their life or in their community are problems that could be solved by reaching a larger group or communicating better why it is they feel apathetic or frustrated, and that's so even if you kind of lead them to the door, they don't go in, as it were. They don't see the obvious benefits that you and I do see. Well,
it needs more than projects and research, doesn't it? And stations existing to provide access. There's a lot to be done in schools. Of course, that's where you're finding us.
Yeah.
I went the other day to Tottenham, where there's an online station called Unity, and that was set up by the council after the riots, 2 years ago, is it? And there's quite an impressive schedule, and the people using it are very much you wouldn't expect to see running programs and so on. So that goes on. I'll give you a completely different example. Sorry, this is something I wanted to say, and it probably has to be edited and put in another part of our conversation. I went to Southall in West London. I'm saying this, you know where it is, but I went to Southall in West London, where the community is very largely Punjabi, and there is a Ofcom licensed radio station called Desi Radio there, and again I found they only broadcast in Punjabi, and so anyone else can't get a look in, I mean can't listen in. I couldn't understand. And why is this? Because the Punjab was divided at the time of the sorry, I can't remember what it's called, the partition. Sorry, the Punjab was divided at the time of the partition, and forcibly, you know, Pakistan was created on one side of it, and India on the other. And within that area, of course, there are four faiths: Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. And the answer I got from Southall was that we still need to have some kind of integration within our community, and that's our main focus, and that's why we're not broadcasting in English as well, because for a long time that community
they need to speak to each other.
They do, because what has been happening for centuries is people have been speaking to them, reading from books, preaching sermons, and so on, and it's been a one-way communication. And for a long time that station couldn't get anything but music from people, and now they've begun to talk after about 8 or 9 years. But that's needed a continuous presence, and of course there's work being done in schools, those people.
So we should just say something about the kind of the policy will that lies behind it, because there are these kind of fantastic initiatives all over the place. When you go to them, they're often very exciting. They're not always there when you go and see them 5 years later, and they don't have the reach that they would like to have, and that I suppose we think others might benefit from if they could get there too. And I suppose I'm just puzzled really that the great and the good who have the money to say let there be more community radio, let there be more places to teach media literacy, let us see the importance of media in our lives. I'm just puzzled that they don't say that, and sometimes it would be a visible expression of political will might be enough. I mean, yes, money helps, and enabling kind of the right kinds of sources of funding and regulation help too, but often it's just a kind of legitimation of those activities, that they don't feel unvalued and, you know, here today and gone tomorrow. And I am genuinely puzzled why, you know, even in European governments who you might, or you know, or North America you might say, are so advanced in getting broadband into every home, getting laptops and tablets into every school, you know, recognising the importance of digital media, they still don't say we need to have a rigorous programme whereby people get to engage with this kit, learn how to use it, learn to think critically of it, understand its possibilities and its downsides, and we need to have everyone in some sense feeling that they have access to that kind of learning, informal generally. I am actually genuinely puzzled why it's not happening.
We've had this form of radio in this country since 2004.
Right.
At the start, £500,000 was given for start-up money. Nobody wants to see the government paying for everything, of course. It was to help stations start up. The study done by Everett, commissioned by Ofcom at the time, forecast that £8 million should be available if this was to get going. From 15 stations at the start, we now have 200, and they still only have £500,000. And I and others have been, the Community Media Association in this country, have been trying to get successive governments to see that, to raise that amount of money. And one of the problems is, I think, that community radio, community media generally, are so holistically touching on so many different aspects of life, education, health, and so on, that the money ought to come from different departments. Of course, it isn't just media, it's about political activity, it's social improvement, social change, and so on. But people think in compartments here, and you know, it's only the DCMS in our language, that's the media ministry, that will.
Yeah, I completely agree, and you can see exactly the same thing happening in media literacy. So you can say people need to be able to make informed and intelligent judgments about finding information online, and then I give an example of, I don't know, finding good medical information, and they'll say, oh well, the Department of Health should support that, and I'll say, well, I'm especially interested in children, and they'll say, well, that's the Department of Education, and then I'll say, well, what about more content in different languages, and they'll say that's the Department of Media, and you know, on it goes, and or then you say this is especially good for helping people who don't have a voice, who are disadvantaged in some way, and so that's the Department of Communities. And nobody kind of comes together and says, actually, this is important in many ways for all kinds of people.
The Labour government, some time ago,
I remember.
we'd got as far as a minister there saying he would go and argue for that. And the good example from way back is the Canadians' Challenge for Change program, or Société Nouvelle, which was inspirational and created a lot of interest and following in Europe in the 70s, 80s, where the federal departments of the kind you're describing were gathered together, representatives in a committee which funded the work of the National Film Board of Canada in this area, Challenge for Change. But just to answer the more general, the European question about policy, there's an organisation called the Community Media Forum for Europe, CMFE, and of course there's AMARC Europe, which is known about in Spain.
And there are European level media literacy organisations as well,
yeah,
but
of
they
course, yes.
don't
but
have
these,
a lot of consequence.
what I think is what's clear is that there are some countries where there is a recognised sector which is receives some finance, but in other countries where this kind of radio is associated, is called independent, is lumped with commercial, and so there isn't a safeguarded sector. And there are certain countries that first recognised it, like Hungary, and now are pushing it into a corner because of the government's change. Nordic countries are very good, the Netherlands, Germany, France. France has got a really good system where the profits of the audiovisual, commercial audiovisual sector are creamed off to provide a fund for what they call associative radio. In Spain, I believe it depends on the autonomous regions. In Barcelona, it's wonderful. I'm not sure about Andalusia.
No, but Spain is complicated because it's a competence between the state and the regions, and then it's a competence that it's anywhere.
And in Germany, it's always times 16, which is just horrible. Media literacy is down to the.
But for example, you talk about Germany. Just to finish, Germany, you know that there exist open channels that are community media. And in television and radio, there exists from a long time. And the last 10 years, for example, this kind of community media, they improve their commitments with media literacy.
Fantastic.
And they are doing the both together and combining locally, no? Because this community media, it's a community media established in a city, for example, no, in Basel, and then they share this purpose of to be community television, but at the same time to develop media literacy projects at schools. Do we think it's possible?
Right
this in
Yes, and I think they raise
Why not?
money.
Whose money does it have?
But they take a penny. They take a penny off the license fee in Germany, something like that, something as small as that.
Yes.
Well, they call it.
Yeah,
a
but
penny.
even having a license fee is not, it's a privilege. It's not common across Europe.
But media educators, maybe they are involved together with these community channels.
I think very often the media educators, especially if they're working through schools or libraries, are divorced from the media organisations and media channels, and so that's another kind of a structural problem, really. So what happens in schools may have absolutely nothing to do with the radio or the newspaper in that town or in that city, and they don't necessarily make those connections at all. So. But they might, and they could, and we wish they would.
Did I sense you're coming to an end of this?
Sorry?
Yes.
Are you coming to an end?
Yes, I think.
Yeah.
I just want to say this is the longest conversation that Sonia and I have had. Because
no, it's in the end.
Very good.
But
it's the longest conversation where we haven't talked about our children.
Yes.
That's good.
But it has been very for us, I think, and for you, I expect also.
Yeah, it's nice to be asked to talk to somebody serious.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
I hope this worked.
Yeah.
It was all right, was it?
It was just
They grew up.
Yes.
That's what I was just thinking. Bloody hell, they
Thank
grew
you very
up.
much. Sir.
I've got both living villas still.
Oh yeah.
Have you?
Well, Anna has got her last year to go, but she will come back. Yes. Oh joy. Yes.
Do you want any more of these, or should I give them?